Well, I was born in Hamilton, and we lived in the same house all my life. We lived up in the southwest end, and I went first to Ryerson School, then I went to Earl Kitchener, then I went to Westdale. I was brought up in the community. The area I was brought up in was at that time not very Jewish. There weren't many Jews in the neighborhood. In the southwest at that time, I think there was only the Lyons, the Epsteins, and ourselves, and I guess the Levy's lived up there. There's about 4 or 5 families, and in the southwest.
What street?
On Kent Street, just off Aberdeen. And you know, you knew you were Jewish. Most of my friends and went to school with were not Jewish, you know. So I really was in two worlds in many ways, in that a lot of my sort of socializing was non-Jewish to some degree, but you realized there was a difference, especially over social things. It seemed to me that you knew there was a difference. And but I was brought up to with a name like Goldberg. You know, you were obviously Jewish, and my father was. We weren't Orthodox or anything. My father was the first boy bar mitzvah at Beth Jacob in about 1890, and he always wanted to. He married late. My mother was about 20 years younger than he is, and I was the fourth, last child, and we lived in a nice home there, and Dad ran a hotel, and it seemed an uncomplicated life to me, really.
He ran a hotel in Hamilton?
Yeah, he owned a hotel in Hamilton, sure.
He owned the hotel?
Yeah.
Where?
On the old King George Hotel on Market Square. My grandfather lived on Park Street south, across from the Big Henry Mansion. My grandfather was a great entrepreneur in Hamilton, and had a great deal of sort of involvement in Hamilton, and he came over here as a very young man. I think he was in the scrap business at one time, and then he sort of was a developer, and I never knew him because he died before I was born. But my grandmother, whose picture's up there, and that's both he and them, and I'm named after my grandfather. And so we were sort of felt this was our home. We were really, in a way, like a second generation. My father was only 2 years old, and he came over 3 years old. All his brothers and sisters were born in Hamilton. So we really had no contact with sort of at least direct family contact. And then we used to summer in Winona. We had a farm in Winona up by the lake. We used to spend all summers there. And
you went to the Beth Jacob?
Well, my father played both ends against the middle. My father belonged to the Beth Jacob, and he belonged to Temple Eshisholam from day one, or early on. And we used to go to the high holidays. He'd always go to 1 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon. And so we went to both. But we were really brought up in Eshisholam as Reform. His dad really wasn't all for sort of being ultra-Orthodox, nor was Mother. So we went to both shuls, but really went to Eshisholam. I went to Sunday school in Eshisholam, and it was bar mitzvah at Eshisholam. So, and then Beth Jacob, I always remember Wendy's grandfather, because I was a kid. He always up going Shaw, Shaw to everybody up on the bima, and I had very fond memories of Beth Jacob, except that I really wasn't sort of involved in this as much as I was in that show.
The Sunday school that you mentioned at the temple.
Yeah.
Do you remember anything about it? Do you remember anyone else who went besides yourself?
Oh yeah, yeah, quite a few people. Who else was? Wilf Jarofsky went. Betty Lyons, Joyce Feinberg. Who else? Quite a few people I remember. And Rabbi Feldman was a great influence of mine. He was a remarkable man. And he was the rabbi at that time. He was he was a very wise man. He used to always tell you, duty came first and things like that, which was very impressive. But it was, as you know, Anshe Sholem was very reform at that time, and.
What year are you talking?
I was born in 25, so talking about, I remember maybe 6, 7 years of age going there. And so it's 30 or 31. And Rabbi Feldman was a very, very wise man. And as a matter of fact, interesting experience is that Mother, the day before he died, we went swimming at station, 26 at thing. And I had a close friend called Bobby Park. And Mother took Bobby Park and me and Rabbi Feldman, and we went swimming. And the next day he had a heart attack and died. And that would be about, it's hard to remember, maybe 40, well, wait, Bobby died in the war. And it would be about 40, 41, around the early part of the war.
Where was this place where you went swimming?
Oh, you can tell the young generation. Station 26 was down at the beach, just towards the Burlington side of the beach, and it was quite an area. A lot of the Jewish families went there. Jerry used to go down there in the summer, but we do, and used to go down there and go swimming. And
well, maybe one of you, we need to hear about this because no one else has mentioned it. And
well, I think Jerry should talk about the beach because she really spent a lot of time. I sort of lived in more isolation because we sort of lived in the Southwest, not say isolated, but sort of somewhat isolated from the Jewish community. And then I spent, as a kid, all my summers from about June until late June until early September at this farm at Winona, and it was sort of isolated, and you sort of had to make do for yourself. It was sort of Chekhovian in many ways, and it was, and I had a pony there, and I used to and dogs, and it was sort of a rustic life.
You say that you lived in the Southwest and were mainly isolated. What does that mean? I'm trying to figure out what that means. I mean, is it that you had nothing to do with people who belonged to the other synagogue?
No, you went to school all day, and your whole context was, it was sort of outside the Jewish community, and yet we were a part of it. That's a strange sort of a dichotomy that's hard to explain, really. But obviously, I felt at that time, that experience. And
when
I was school, for example, and when I went to school, I would be the only Jewish kid in the class, or maybe two. Dave Epstein and I guess were only two. So my very closest friends were often non-Jewish people.
Let me just try to ask you to talk about something that happened quite a long time ago. But was there a big to-do in Hamilton, as best you recall, when the State of Israel was founded?
Oh yeah. Oh. I think it was. This was just after the war. I remember they tried to get. I remember they wanted my brother Dave to go to Israel to fly because he had a brilliant career in the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was commander of the CO of the City of Windsor Squadron in Italy, and he had been shot down in France and escaped. So I remember that. I remember a whole bunch of men coming to the house and talking to Dave.
Did he go?
No, he felt he had enough war. And Dad was very excited when I'm going. And he felt he sort of survived because he survived being shot down, And But I think, you know, we were always supporters of Israel, and we weren't Zionists. Now, through interesting Zionist families, the Epsteins, of course, who lived up the street from us, there's nobody around. Dave Epstein just died. They were very strong Zionists because Mrs. Epstein was a brother to A.J. Freeman, who you probably don't know, but A.J. Freeman was head of the Jewish Zionist movement in Canada, I think, one time. And he had the biggest department store in Ottawa. He was to Ottawa what Eaton's was to Toronto. A.J. Freeman, yeah.
Really?
It was the store in Ottawa. And as a matter of fact, we always sort of felt part of that because David's older brother went to Israel when he was 13 to become educated and died of polio. And this was a sort of a tragedy that was always talked about. And I think he was only about 15 when he died. And I guess they had a big polio epidemic then. So he went over there. So it was always that, and because I was really close with David Epstein, we were close but not close. But we were sort of friends for years. I'd heard the story over and over again, you know. And they just lived up the street from us.
Do you remember any Jewish organizations that were prominent in the city that people belonged to?
At that time, I don't remember the B'nai B'rith too much, but it was obviously there. My dad was not a great joiner of anything. He also, I remember as a kid, they came and gave him his 50-year Mason pin. And he was so surprised when they presented this to him. He'd never been to a meeting. He'd paid dues for 50 years. So he always supported things. I mean, he always gave generously to the shul and to any, you know, all the organizations. But he was not much of a joiner. My mother was a little more. She actually, I think, was president, was she, of the Jewish?
She was of the Council of Jewish Women.
She was president of the Council of Jewish Women, so she was rather involved in it.
When you grow up in Hamilton and you're the only Jewish kid in the class, I think you said, do you remember if anti-Semitism ever became an issue at all? Or anything?
Oh, I remember vividly. I remember the Germans going. I remember 1936 vividly, the day the Germans went into Austria. I don't know why that's such a striking memory, but I remember going to school and knowing about it. Oh, yeah, I think we were aware we're very different, and we were aware of anti-Semitism.
Was there any that you?
Nothing overt.
In Hamilton. In the city.
Well, just sort of subtly, you know. I mean, many of these friends belonged to clubs which I knew Jews couldn't belong to. You know, the Hamilton Club, to the Ancaster, to, you know, the whole. I mean, you felt really very different, you know, socially. You were sort of friends, but not friends.
But there weren't that many Jews in the city.
Oh, there were. They're the same as there are now.
Beg pardon?
Probably the same as there are now.
I don't think so. I mean, the number of Jews in the 1940s wasn't quite the number of Jews that are in Hamilton today.
I don't know. Do you don't think, Jerry, was it 4 or 5?
No, I don't. I think there were about, I remember vaguely 500 Jewish families.
Yeah, so there's less, yeah.
No, it's obviously less than you know, in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
But when there's only one Jew or 3 Jews, that's quite different from when there is a presence of Jews.
Yeah.
And then it's easier to target. When you're only 1 or 2,
Yeah.
it's easier to blend in, kind of. But
Yeah. Well, no, but there was a presence of Jews in the city because, you know, a lot of the stores downtown, the men's store, and you know, a lot of things were Jewish businesses.
was there a community center when you were growing up?
Oh, no. Was there? Not before the war.
During the war?
Well, at that time I'd gone to university, though. 42. I don't.
There was on John Street.
What John Street?
You were away then.
I don't remember as a kid at the John Street. I don't remember that.
Let's fast forward. Do you mind if I jump in here?
Go ahead.
Okay, fast forward.
Yeah.
You're now a practicing physician in Hamilton.
No, I'm retired.
Well, I'm going back.
Oh, and then I went.
I'm going back.
Well, actually, why I literally left Hamilton at age 17.
Okay.
So I went to Western, and and then I went to medical school at Western, and at Western I was aware of a little more of not anti-Semitism, but the fraternity thing there came up then, and so you realize the difference, and but and Wendy's father was a Western at that time, and again there weren't many Jewish kids at Western, but we developed our own fraternity there. We had a Jewish fraternity. We started it.
What was it called?
But well, the BSR was a big fraternity in the States, Beta Sigma Rho. They had chapters in Toronto, so we became part of an international fraternity. And we bought a house, $1,000 down, got about 10 rooms, and so I went to medical school. I was involved with the university politics there. I was a vice president of student body there, and I had Western was a good time for me. And then I went to intern at Hamilton General Hospital, and I did postgraduate training. And I went back to Western, did postgraduate training at Victoria Hospital. By that time I was married, so I did two things. I went away to school and left Hamilton early, but I came back and enough time to get married, so meet Terry. So that
you knew each other?
No,
No.
never. I came back one Christmas. My sister arranged a blind date.
Really?
I managed to fit him in.
Yeah, I can tell. And that's very good.
And then we got married in 1950, and then that was after my internship, and then we went back to. I was aware of anti-Semitism then, since because when I applied for a junior internship at St. Mike's Hospital in Toronto, and I didn't get in, and several of my classmates got in, and actually I knew that I should have got in, being somewhat modest, but I was on graduate honors, and I was in the Honor Society, and had a lot of things that really should be going for you, and but it was interesting. So I tried to go down and see the sister at St. Mike's and have a talk with the in charge. I was rather upset about it, and I went down there myself, and she wouldn't see me, and but it was interesting when I came back. Some of my other classmates none of them accepted down there. And so then I came to Hamilton General, sort of the easy way out. Hamilton General actually was restricted at one time, very hard. They wouldn't take Jewish interns. The famous story was, who's the dress fellow? Mr. Mack. Lou Mack's son, Eddie Mack, I think it was Eddie, graduated Queens with highest of honors. They wouldn't accept him at the Hamilton General as an intern. Benny Finkelstein couldn't get as an intern. He went to St. Joe's. They were a crusty old lot there.
Well, they were no different than the rest of the country, I'm afraid.
Well, Toronto General was terrible. At Toronto General, very few got in, and as a matter of fact, when I went and trained. Then I left Hamilton and went to, after Hamilton General, I went back to Western for 3 years, and Dr. Bryan, who was my chief there, got me into the Toronto General. But the year I went to Toronto General was the first year there was a real change in the policy. There's a professor there called Ray Farquharson, who really the Jewish community in Toronto should have a monument to. And he took over as chairman, department chief of medicine at Toronto General. And the year that I was there, at the Toronto General, there were only 6 senior residents and 1 chief resident, and he took 3 Jewish senior residents, and the chief resident was Jewish, and just broke the barrier.
Why did he do that?
he was just a very, very liberal guy, and I think he realized Duncan Graham, who'd been the chairman before him, was so anti-everything. As one Italian physician told me once, he said, "Don't feel bad." He said he was no better to you know, to an Italian Catholic or a French Canadian. You know, it was just.
Here's a different question, which doesn't really connect to what
Yeah.
you were just talking about, but it does connect to the point that you didn't know each other
Yeah.
until you came back to Hamilton. Was it the case when you're growing up, and you could think about this for after, that you know, it was important to your folks that you find someone who was Jewish to marry, or was it that you know, Jews were marrying non-Jews?
Well, it was sort of. Oh no, I think I'm not sure my father would have been. You know, my mother was much more concerned about being marrying Jewish, and that was a. I think that it was sort of expected of it. Yet I didn't always go with Jewish girls, and neither there nor university, and. But I think the family would have, but they wouldn't have disowned you or anything like that. But I think my mother was quite vehement about that.
Were there people that you knew?
Well, my brother,
married.
Yeah.
I see.
And that was, in her mind, a bone of contention.
Which brother?
David. And so then I came back to practice in Hamilton and as a consultant in medicine, and the group just did consulting medicine at that time. Now we say, what's different about that? Well, what happened in the country as a whole, and even in the United States, most people in internal medicine, which I trained in, would sort of do sort of a family practice of internal medicine. They would see it was adult medicine. You'd try to be a consultant. But a group came here to Hamilton. I see Jack Sibley and that chap, and then Bill Walsh and Joe Power and Al McNabb before, and they were here just 1 year before me. And they decided that we should all try to be consultants. We all wanted to be consultants. So we actually had a unique, is we would only see patients referred to us by family doctors or other doctors. And at that time, it was very hard to make a living doing that, even in Toronto. So the top guys at Toronto General, anybody could phone them up, make an appointment, especially if you're paying patients. In those days, paying patients were important because there were a great number of people who weren't covered with anything and couldn't afford health. And but we stuck to our guns and as a group, and I think really developed consulting medicine in many ways in the province. Not many people seem to ever remember that, but it was a because anyways, but at that time that was sort of before subspecialization. So you know, we were consultants, and rather immodest way. We at age 29 we were a consultant in anything, you know, any disease you want. So.
Can I interject here because he's too modest?
Please do.
He was doing everything. And then young people would come on and he would have 6 hats. He would give all the hats away. You know, he was very generous about bringing new people onto the staff. And he started the
Well, then I went to St. Joe.
Unit there. You started the Firestone unit. You brought Mike Newhouse in. He started everything.
Well, I was at the General. What happens? I worked at the General Hospital, and frankly, it was really not a great place. Hamilton was not a great place medically, frankly, up until that time. Starting maybe around 49 or 50, started to change somewhat, but from administration-wise point of view, and from a it was really not very far advanced. And so when a lot of group of we came in, and I was at the General, and I wasn't really too happy there, and I couldn't get things done I wanted to do, and I was considered a pretty new boy in the street. When they opened the new St. Joe's in '62, they asked me to be chief of medicine, so I went there as chief of medicine, and that's when they gave me the ability to do what I wanted, really, and so that's when I brought all these people on, because I knew at that time subspecialization was coming. Before that, a lot of guys would hold on. You see, they'd say, they were scared the new cardiologist would come, he'd take heart away or kidney. It was a great, medicine was always a thing of protecting their territory. And I saw quite clearly that that was not the way to go, and it's not the way that any successful place went. So I just wanted to bring on people, so we brought in people in all the subspecialties. And I was interested in dialysis. That's why I bought the renal dialysis unit, because actually I had dialyzed a patient in London. I think we were the first person to dialyze in North America. And it's sort of a long, complicated story, but Caulfield developed the kidney, developed it in Holland during the war, because frankly he had nothing else to do. The war was on, and he was academically, and he built an artificial kidney. And interestingly enough, after the war, 2 people from his department came to Western to do physiology. They were scientists, and I have no idea why, but they built a kidney. But they weren't clinicians. They never used it, and they put it in the cellar. And in 1951, we had a patient with acute renal failure, and my chief, Frank Bryan, said, "Why don't we dialyze the patient?" So we didn't know how to do it, and he didn't know how to do it. So we sort of makeshifted it, and we actually dialyzed the patient. And we started on Friday night at around 6 o'clock, and we finished up, I think, Monday afternoon. And used sausage tubing in those days for the blood to go through. That was springing leaks, and we were phoning Armour, the sausage maker in Cleveland or someplace, or Chicago, to get them to send more sausage tubing. So I was intrigued with this. We actually dialyzed this girl, and she actually got some better, but unfortunately she did not have an acute problem. Her kidneys just didn't go back, she died. But I was very impressed with the dialysis. And so then in the early 60s, at the General, we decided we would dialyze the patient in Hamilton, Al McNabb and I. So this is how different medicine was. We heard they were dialyzing in Buffalo, called a McNeil Collins dialyzer, and we went to Al McNabb and I and a nurse. I saw this nurse about a month ago or 2 months ago. I hadn't seen her in years. We went to Buffalo, and the Anthone brothers were dialyzing, and they were using this called McNeil. The McNeil something, a dialyzer was a horrible primitive thing. So we went and watched them do it. We came back and we got a dog, and there were no dog labs in Hamilton. So Al and I got a dog. I know where we got the dog, from the pound, I guess. And we took the dog up to a vet up the mountain, and he anesthetized the dog for us. We put the dog in the back of the car and took it down to the General Hospital, Hamilton General, and we took a gurney out through the emergency, and we hid the dog on a gurney, took the dog in and took the dog upstairs, and we dialyzed the dog with McNeil Collins things, and the dog survived, and it was fine. So we were there, trained dialysis, so we did acute dialysis. So we actually dialyzed quite a few patients, and had a few. You can only get one dialysis in. That's the trouble, and the trouble is that in the acute renal failure, the shutdown, they often would need 2 or 3, and the odd time you get away with 1, but it was real brinksmanship. But anyways, it's good, because the point is we died. So I was fascinated, but then a thing called peritoneal dialysis came in, which is much easier for acute dialysis. And then I once went to a meeting, and I heard a chap talk from Seattle who had the first dialysis unit in Seattle. And I thought we should get into that business. And that's when I started the renal dialysis unit of it at St. Joe's. And we had the first real big unit in Ontario. A fellow named Art Shimizu actually went to Westdale with Jerry. Another example of prejudice, his father was a very well-off fellow in BC. They were Japanese, and of course he was sent away, and he ended up being a gardener at Mac. And Art worked as a houseman for somebody in town to make a living so he could get through medical school. And he was an interesting guy. And Art and Jerry went to high school together, and Art was quite a character. And I don't know how I heard. Either he heard I was interested or I heard he knew. He was being trained in dialysis by Michael Kay in Montreal. So I got in touch with him, and I said, why don't we set it, would you come back to Hamilton? So I went to Sister Mary Grace and said we should open the dialysis unit. And she said, fine. And you couldn't get away with it these days, but she said, well, we should build it. Well, how do you do that? I said, well, I don't know. I build a dialysis unit, this whole new world, doing chronic dialysis. I said, there's a unit in Montreal where Art Shimizu is working, Mike Case. She said, well, that's easy. She said, just take the architect. You and the architect go down to Montreal and have a look at what and see what you build. So the architect and I, gosh, I can't remember his name, and he was the first architect of the hospital, not the main architect, one of the other. And he and I went to Montreal. He went in the unit, looked around, he made a couple of notes. We went and had a good dinner and came home. And she built the unit. So the unit's all built, and we knew it wouldn't get built in time, so we sent Art to Kolf, was then working in Cleveland. We sent Art to spend another year of training with Kolf, and what happened is then Art. So we had the unit all built. Art was going back, and the Minister of Health decided they heard about this, so they came down. They said, "But sister, you didn't ask for permission. How can you build a?" She said, "So it was all built." She said, "Isn't that what you wanted?" And he said, "I guess so." That was it. So you compare that with doing things now. It would have taken 20 years to get the whole thing through. And so I got interested. So that's how we developed St. Joe's, and we changed St. Joe's from being rather having it had some real problems, and they brought in a new medical director. In any case, it worked out very well. So I had 20 years there, developed and then the university came, and I became part of the university. But we're trying to be. We really had a tremendous go at St. Joe's of developing all these things. I brought Mike Newhouse, brought him in to start the respirology unit.
So Billy, getting back to the whole Jewish thing, when you think about the years of your prime and the contribution made by Jewish physicians to this community, could you say a few words about that? Not including yourself, but also other Jewish physicians.
Well, Joe Minnan, I think, was probably certainly if not probably the best surgeon in Hamilton. But of course, Joe had his own thing. I mean, surgery was not very open for Jews, all across North America. Internal medicine was a little more open. I have no idea why, but surgery we held out the last. Sort of even like engineering was even difficult. My brother was a graduate of MIT, who came back to Canada, who was an engineering officer in the Air Force, and he worked actually with the guy who developed the jet engine in England. Irwin worked with him on the first jet engines in Manchester. During the war, even though he was in the Air Force, he was seconded out. When he came back to Canada, he couldn't get a job as an engineer. I mean...
and this you think is because he was Jewish?
Oh, sure, I know. I mean, to go to MIT at that time, it was very few people. He went from Queens, first year Queens, and was accepted second year MIT. So the whole background and this was true in the medical thing. So in Hamilton, we only had three specialists. We're Jewish. Mike Carr, who really was a great contributor. Mike was probably one of the best pediatricians I've ever come across, best clinicians I ever came across. And Joe Minden and myself. And then for a while there we had what was his name? I can't remember his name. When the obstetrician gynecologist, Mo Ellenswag, from the bakery, Ellenswag's, he was an obstetrician gynecologist, but he left town and went to the States. So we only three of us were specialists. And that was the only time you could do something to change things in hospitals. You know, all the other chaps were family doctors, who I think but there weren't many Jewish doctors when I was a kid in Hamilton. The only Jewish doctor in Hamilton when I was a kid was two. It was Dr. Steinberg, who was our doctor, and Ted Siegel, and not Ted, Ted's father.